Hello and welcome to SciLux, the podcast where we talk about scientific developments and technological changes in Luxembourg. And of course, don't forget, we are powered by Research Luxembourg and recording at the RTL City Studios. Our guest today is Professor Eugenio Peluso, who is the director of the Living Conditions Department at LISER, Luxembourg Institute of Socio-Economic Research. His research interests include the analysis of inequality, decisions under risk, urban inequalities, and the effects of migration on inequality. He is also affiliated professor at the University of Luxembourg and professor of economic policy on leave at the University of Verona. Professor Peluso, thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here.
I'm happy to hear that. I hope you say the same at the end of the podcast, because some of the guests get very pale, you know. They're like, oh, it's done. I'm happy. So let's see. I will ask you probably if you are still happy. Okay, so this is the subject of today's discussion. We'll talk a lot about inequality, of course, because that's what you specialize in. And of course, I was doing a little bit of research myself and talking to people around. It was very interesting because I was asking, like, what do you think? What should I talk about if I talk about inequality? And I got a lot of interesting feedback because, of course, everyone looks at it differently. And I think that might be also a problem because this is one of those subjects that everyone has some opinion about, I guess. So when you say what you specialize in, do people often say like, oh, yes, you should change this? Or people suggest things to you as well or not?
Yeah, it's true. It's a very heterogeneous topic that can be approached from different perspectives. Inequality is an important matter for political scientists, economists, statisticians, and also mathematicians. So, of course, anyone has his own opinion. And here I'll try to focus mainly on the economic approach, the economic perspective.
Okay, so let's start with the economic perspective. As you said, we can talk about a lot of different types of inequality from the economic perspective. What are they? What do you look at, or do you specialize in something in particular?
Yeah, so the starting point is what we deal with inequality. We have in mind mainly income or wealth inequality. Personally, I started my scientific career studying a specific type of inequality that are intra-household inequality, that is the inequality between family members. And so this was my starting point, let's say. I wrote some articles on this topic trying to explain the link between inequality between households and inequality between individuals. So, for instance, if we measure income inequality looking at household, is this also meaningful in terms of individual well-being? Or, for instance, in the households, we have some type of disparity that can bias these results when we have in mind the individual well-being. This was the starting point. Then I tried to enlarge my research interest, looking at the multidimensional aspects of inequality, because income is cannot capture everything. And then it's also important to consider inequality from a multiple perspective, having in mind, for instance, inequality in other dimensions. And then I first focus on the measurement of multidimensional inequality. So it's a quite technical issue. So if you have one variable, income, then you can think to use standard statistical measures in order to assess and measure inequality. But when you have many dimensions, for instance, income, health, education, you have some difficulties. For instance, some variables are continuous numerical, other variables are qualitative. And then you have to find the right way to tackle these difficulties. And then I worked in this area. One application of this work was the analysis of quality of life within the cities. And there are several reports accounting for quality of life levels in different big cities, considering, for instance, income, but other important components like crime, segregation, the quality of environment, and so on. And so I try to put everything together by producing a unique indicators able to capture not only the average quantity of these variables within the city, but also the possible inequality in different districts. And so to do this, I applied some advanced tool in inequality analysis that were not usually adopted in this area of urban economics. Then I continue on this analysis of multidimensional inequality, focusing on multidimensional deprivation. Here, with some colleagues, we develop a new indicator of multidimensional deprivation, and now the challenge at LISER is to apply these new tools for concrete problems. We are already trying to do our best to improve the quality of our research, also based on the results of our scientific works.
I don't know if I remember all the questions I wanted to ask because there were so many different steps that you just made me think. But I wanted to start with the first one. When you were analyzing the inequality within a family, did that actually improve your own? I'm sorry, I know that from a private perspective, was your partner saying like, but you're studying inequality and you didn't do your dishes or not? How did it go? Was it used against you or not?
Yeah. It's a tricky question.
Exactly, right?
And to some extent, I have to say that working on these topics, you can find some good rules or some good behaviors, let's say, but then it is very difficult to follow these recommendations that come from theory.
Yes, theory is great, but then practice, right?
Yeah,
of course.
Right.
But at least it's, half success. You already theoretically know what should be done.
Exactly.
Okay, and now for the multidimensional inequality, as you said. As I understood, it's a kind of a variable, an indicator, where you try to put all the different inequalities. But then what's the percentage shared? Do you put something that is more important in your opinion in there? How do you kind of combine all those inequalities in one multidimensional inequality?
I don't know what is your education background, but you capture one of the two main issues in this type of analysis. One is exactly the weight that you can give to each dimension. For instance, in my application to urban quality of life, we applied a sort of empirical exercise in the sense that we look at the value that people give to each dimension, trying to extract this value to the housing price. So if you see that, for instance, having more public transport or less crime gives more value to the housing dwelling in this area, then we computed the weight based on this. But of course, you can also have a fully normative approach where you, as a researcher, you try to capture a sort of normative point of view, and then this could be the point of view of a social planner who decides the weights for each dimension. But this is only one of the problems. The second one, that is, let's say, less evident, is based on the fact that often when we look at statistics and the results on several dimensions, the results are collected in this way. In the city, to give you an example, you have half of the population poor and half of the population with low education. And it seems all, no? So you consider two dimensions and you identify the percentage of poverty or low education within this population. Here, there is a more subtle problem, that is the fact that a situation like this could represent a case where half of the population is rich but without education, and the other half of the population is poor but well educated, or vice versa. You concentrate all the poverty, let's say, on half of the population. And this is the second aspect. So when we try to analyze multidimensional inequality, we have also to give importance to the correlation between poverty or the level of the different outcomes and their concentration across the population. And this is exactly one of the main areas where we try to improve our methods in order also to account for this difficulty.
You mentioned education, so I think we can smoothly move on to one of the projects that you are working on that is not finished yet, right? So the research project looking at education in Luxembourg and the disparities. Could you tell us a little bit about where you are with it, what you know by now?
Yeah, indeed, we are still waiting for data. So
so you can't tell us.
But this is the second project on this topic, and we already have work on the Socio-Economic index that is used by the Ministry of Education to allocate the resources, the teachers across the different municipalities in Luxembourg, and we provided some preliminary results in this area. First of all, we had a good result, that is that the methodology that is currently applied by the Ministry of Education is robust, so it's solid. We try to use alternative indicators or to change the weights for the variables and so, but overall we are happy with the current methodology. About the evolution of socioeconomic disparities, at the moment I'm not allowed to reveal the results.
I'm going to get a scoop
here. What I can say is that over time, in the last 15 years, focusing on deprivation, so on the fact that there are families that concentrate problems in several dimensions, we observe an increase of deprivation across municipalities in Luxembourg. This is something that we can safely say.
I recently saw on the media there was a project, I think 2 photographers taking pictures of homeless people. And there was a big discussion about the fact that there's definitely a rising number and we can notice a lot more about it. But again, I don't have the exact data, but we do see differences in Luxembourg. And of course, there's housing as well that has to be discussed. And we will discuss it in a minute, because of course I want to know that too. But first, I wanted to ask you to ask the pub quiz question that is related to inequalities, but not necessarily to Luxembourg. So if you can ask the question, and listeners, remember, the answer will be only at the end of the podcast.
I have a very peculiar question. I would like to know from our public what is the link between Robin Hood, philosophy, and inequality.
Perfect. I have no idea. I mean, I always say that and then I reveal that my guest shared some ideas. But in general, I'm very curious to learn the answer. So remember, only at the end of the podcast. And then we leave Robin Hood, because that's not a native Luxembourger. And we come back to Luxembourg itself. So another project that is pretty current, where you were looking at inequality, disparities, and socioeconomic situation, was looking at housing in Luxembourg, right? So what can we say there? What's the situation?
Yeah, we try to quantify, to assess the difficulties of household families in Luxembourg. And for this reason, we publish a couple of reports that in this case are fully available on the website of LISER and also of the Ministry of Housing. And these reports try to quantify what we call the housing burden, that is the ratio between the expenses of families for housing in general, mortgage, rents, and electricity. So the expenditure strictly connected with housing and the income of the different families. What we discovered is not surprising, honestly. First of all, we divided the population in 5 income quintiles, so 20% poorest and so on. And it's clear that the housing burden is much higher for the poorest part of the population, but also reaching some sides that was not expected. It's about also 50% for some families. And then we focus also on the different weight for renters compared to people who have to repay a mortgage. And here the situation is, of course, similar. But anyway, there is a difference between being remaining at the end with the property or not. And finally, the most interesting part of this research, I think, is when we did not use the concept of equalize income. Here it's a little bit technical, because when you want to study the population, of course, you have to compare different types of households, no? And then we try to homogenize all their incomes by applying some discount factors that we call equivalence scales that are produced at the European level. They can be more or less precise, but anyway, it's a way to proceed, let's say. And then, so there is this first exercise where we do not consider the different type of households. And since we were not fully happy with this approach, we also decided to focus on the different types of households in order to show the typology with most important problems in this area. And as expected, at least after some reports and research in Luxembourg, the type of family with the main problems are adults with children. When you have one adult with two or more children, the difference with respect to the other type of households is impressive. So I think this is the most exposed type of family in Luxembourg to any type of economic shock.
So the difference, you mean it's the most difficult for such families because of the cost of the size that they have to afford to have those children under the roof, or what's the problem?
Yeah, the problem is we simply consider two numbers. Imagine a ratio where you have at the numerator the expenditure for housing, okay, and below you have the income. This means that they have to pay more than a single, for instance, but they have to care about two or more children, and then maybe their income is not, let's say, sufficient to cover all these expenses.
When we talk about Luxembourg, I try not to do the comparison, but it's difficult not to. So when you actually...
Sorry if I interrupt you, but just to give another intuition of the difficulty. So imagine that you are a mother with two kids, and you look for an apartment. You are not rich, of course, otherwise no problem. And then you try to save on the sides of the apartment, maybe the location and so on. This means that overall maybe you are in competition, and this is in Luxembourg, with good income that can that can rent the same apartment. So there is also a pressure from the point of view of the characteristic of the dwelling unit that they look for and of the market. And here there is, as you know, there is a shortage of supply, and then also a lot of demand from people coming from abroad, and all this pressure is concentrated on this category of family.
Oh, that's interesting. I've never thought about that. Thank you for mentioning it. Thank you for interrupting me then. When it comes to Luxembourg, I wanted to say, I know we're small, so we should not try to compare with Germany all the time or whatever. But still, I was wondering, could you say that this kind of analysis that you've done to look at housing and what people can afford and how much of the income goes into housing was done in other countries, and it's a similar situation, or do we have a special case for Luxembourg?
No, I have to say that, I'm not an expert of comparisons across countries in this area, but from our preliminary studies, just in order to have a broad idea, so the main difference is not across countries, is maybe Luxembourg overall is a city. And then comparing Luxembourg with other big cities, the difference is not so surprising. These problems are also visible in Paris, in Milan, in other big cities. But here there are some peculiarities because of the acceleration of housing prices in the last 20 years that is surprising, and also maybe needs some adjustments and interventions. And so for this reason, we collaborate with the Ministry of producing every year an update to give a precise view about this evolution of prices. And we also collaborate on the topic of housing taxation.
So fingers crossed, something's going to change, because I think we all need it. We don't want to be frontalier, all of us, at least not me. Not yet. I don't know how to say it. Okay, another report I wanted to look at, because, we're jumping a little bit, but it's all inequality, but in different spheres, right? Of course, a lot of you scientists during COVID times looked at some changes that we noticed because of COVID. And the report you prepared that was very interesting was this idea of looking at gender inequality in COVID. So what was the report about, and what did you find out?
Yeah, we work in collaboration with the Ministry of Equal Opportunities in order to analyze this particular aspect of the COVID crisis in Luxembourg. First of all, even in this case, in the end, we were happy because of the lack of surprising results. In the sense that here, the redistributive policies and the social protection measure adopted by the government were quite effective. So we did not discover an increase of inequality or poverty during the COVID time. So this is a good outcome. Before
you go further, redistributive policies, I have to ask that because I know that you also look at that. And to be honest, when I first saw it, I was not sure whether I know what it is or not. So what is it?
It's the way the tax system of a country can also provide a redistribution of income or to protect the poor part of the population. Normally, this principle is implemented also in the constitutions of countries through the progressivity of income taxation, but there are also many other policies that try to complete this basic principle. So all the policies in favor of poor families and helping households with children or with housing, also with bad housing conditions, and so is what we call redistributive policies.
Okay, thank you. I hope you remember where I stopped you. So we go back to the report and gender inequality during COVID times.
Yeah, we studied several areas, but our results were mainly confirming the same results that are well known in other countries. Here, again, if I have to stress one unexpected or not completely clear point, is still the situation of women with children. Again, we found that this category was most affected not only from the, from the economic perspective, but here, I repeat, the interventions of the state were quite good and sufficient to check the difficulties and to repair the possible losses. But especially from the health side, because given the presence of children at home and also the working conditions, the fact that after the initial lockdown, but then people restarted to work, then there were two different sources of risk, let's say, and then they were the most exposed to the risk of infection, and so they were more affected from the point of view of the incidence of COVID-19. Looking at the behavioral side, here, of course, during the lockdown, we observe a strong reduction of social activities. And here, the other surprising result is that at the end of the lockdown, there was a difference between the behavior of men and women. Men were much more active in Luxembourg, so they went back almost immediately to the initial levels of social interaction. And so, while women remained a little bit more, more prudent, and maybe this is also a more general characteristic behavior that is normally attached to the differences between men and women, is that normally women are more risk averse, and then this is something that was also a source of good and safe behavior, so when during the lockdown, but also for the activation of the vaccination campaign.
Or maybe just women were so tired after this all that they just didn't want to go out.
Maybe this is also possible. But this was also true for single women. So there is something more.
Okay, no, I was just looking obviously from the perspective of having to work with kids at home, which was for all of us having kids was very, very tricky for sure. So yeah, but true. If it's single women, then yeah, that theory does not hold. I'm sure you considered it. I mean, I'm not going to come up with something you haven't thought of. Okay, good. So we have those 3 different reports, 3 different outcomes looking at Luxembourg. And I have to say that I tried to read some of the reports. I can't do everything. I mean, it's too many pages for me. But what I noticed, what was interesting for me is yet another equality or inequality that you talk about in one of the reports. It was the equality of opportunity. And what is that? And why is there whole literature and science and everything? I've discovered a new world, basically.
Yeah. Here you are reaching the heart of the problem, because of course our life is full of inequality, and we can also think that many of these inequalities are natural, are also something that is in the nature. So we cannot reverse, and we should not reverse them. But some types of inequality, and in general, the problem of inequality starts to be a concern for policymakers or for scientists and philosophers, at least in the area of social sciences, when we consider that these inequalities are to some extent unfair. Okay, so there is a possibility to look at the income inequality from a normative point of view, explaining why they could be considered from a very abstract perspective as unfair. But I don't want to focus on this. I'll prefer to touch the most recent literature and studies on linking philosophy and statistical measures in order to define a new concept of inequality that is not new in theoretical terms, because equality and inequality of opportunity is present since the Greek philosophers. It's not something new. But what is most interesting is to try to implement this idea of inequality of opportunity in a clear way, and also to have some statistical tools able to measure this inequality of opportunity. In few words, the idea is simple and is also natural. So the idea is that to each individual, you have a set of circumstances, for instance, the family of origin, the country of origin, age, and so, and these are the set of variables, the set of characteristics that go beyond the individual responsibility, education of parents, and so. And then there is the other 2 important components that give the final outcome, and the final outcome could be income, could be health, could be education, and the second component is effort. So given your background, you exert a certain level of effort, and this effort then, together with the circumstances, gives the final result. Of course, there is a third component that is also object of a couple of important studies, that is luck, because you can exert effort, but luck is an important determinant of the final outcome.
All the believers in American dream, all the effort and then luck. What luck?
Luck is important. It's also important. Of course, it is more important at the individual level, but you can, when you consider this analysis, you look at the average, and then you can also say that luck on average can compensate. You see, the plus of someone can compensate the minus of someone else. But anyway, I don't want to discuss about luck. If we focus mainly on circumstances and effort, what we call equality of opportunity is the idea that people with different circumstances should get the same results. So the circumstances that go beyond the individual responsibility should not affect our results. Our results, in other terms, should depend only on our effort. Okay? Then there are two ways to look at the problem. Here we enter into the more technical details, but anyway, there is a so-called ex-ante approach where we say people with the same circumstances should have the same prospect of results based on, imagine that according to your effort you get different outcomes. This should not change, so this distribution should not change, should not be influenced by the circumstances. And then you look, let's say, at the prospect. The second approach, that is the so-called ex post approach, and that implies the possibility of measuring effort. That is not so easy. In some cases this is possible, but in some other cases this is less evident. Then it says we should guarantee that people with the same level of effort get the same result regardless of the circumstances. Okay, so you can look mainly at effort, you can look mainly at circumstances, but these two principles are in the end they coincide. They do not coincide in the way you implement them from a statistical point of view, but overall, so the idea, the basic idea is always the same. We should accept some inequalities, and these inequalities are mainly the ones generated by effort, and we should compensate. Then this is the reward principle. And we should, on the contrary, compensate all the inequality that are generated by circumstances, for instance, education of parents or country of origin, and so on. For Luxembourg, I can add something more concrete after this digression on equality.
Yes, now
opportunity.
practice. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I have just to cite the researcher who formalized these ideas in a book. His name is John Romer, an American professor of economics. Now, coming back to Luxembourg, there are some colleagues of LISER who try to measure inequality of opportunities in Luxembourg in a specific way, for instance, more precisely by measuring the quantity, the percentage of overall inequality that can be explained by the circumstances. Okay, and they compare the results for Luxembourg with the results for other European countries, and here the results are not good. They are not, let's say, encouraging, because Luxembourg has the same inequality of opportunity as in Mediterranean countries that are not normally the more fair places. So here also the trends of equality of opportunity is decreasing in the last 20 years in Luxembourg. And if you want, I can also move from this topic, because we observe similar trends from equality of opportunity to another bad facet of inequality, that is poverty. Because if you look at poverty, the patterns of poverty in Luxembourg, in the last 40 years, there is a very recent research in collaboration between LISER and the LISER Luxembourg Income Study, and the results are not yet published, but what we find is that poverty is increasing over time, let's say from less than 10% to 16%. Here I give also the interpretation of these numbers. Normally poverty is measured by looking at the percentage of the population that falls below the poverty line, where the poverty line is established by considering the median income. So imagine that you rank all the incomes of the Luxembourgish households. You look at the person that is exactly in the middle, and then this is the median income. And then you consider 60% of the median income, and this is what we call the relative poverty threshold. Okay? And then the evolution from the 80s to 2018, that I think was the last year considered for this analysis, is from less than 10% to 16% of the population. And so this seems a bad outcome. But to be sure, and also to question the interpretation of these results, you have not to forget that in these 40 years there was a big economic growth in Luxembourg. And so the median income is growing a lot. It's not the same as in the 80s. And then we repeated the exercise by setting a sort of virtual or arbitrary poverty threshold by considering the one of the 80s, I think it was 84 or 85, and we adapted this value taking into account only the inflation rate over time. In this case, the level of poverty, if you consider then an absolute threshold, is decreasing over time and is less than 5% in the last years. This means that what is increasing is poverty, but in relative terms. We can also rephrase this idea, saying that the poor part of the population is not able in the last years to run at the same speed of the middle class and of the richer part of the population. This is the general pattern, and is also confirmed by the equality of opportunity results. In this research, we also try to identify the characteristics of poor households. So here we cannot talk of causality, so we are not able to say that these are the factors that generate poverty. But anyway, there is a correlation, so these are the most frequent characteristics that we observe. And here there is also a difference. One is age. In the 80s, age was a peculiarity of the poor families, while now is youthness. So is the poverty moved from old to young families. Another characteristic that remained constant over time is the citizenship, that is, people coming from abroad are more exposed in general than local families. And another strong characteristic that is becoming more and more important is education. Education is now an important discriminant between poor and rich people. If you have low education, now you are much more exposed to poverty than 40 years ago. This is not surprising.
No.
But a more surprising factor about education is that within the circumstances that I defined before in the analysis of equality of opportunity, the most important circumstance in Luxembourg, and this is not the case also for all the other countries, is education of the parents. So having parents well educated can make the difference in the results that you get at the end, so for you in your working life.
So now we'd finished the discussion. I go educate myself so I can give better opportunities to my children for sure. But we touched upon poverty, so I think this is a good moment to kind of come back to your pub quiz question, because when I think Robin Hood, I also think the poor and giving to the poor, right? So what was the question once again? And then can you give us the answer?
What is the link between Robin Hood, philosophy, and inequality? Since you asked me to define the concept of inequality and in particular of equality of opportunity, we can complete, let's say, the answer looking at pure inequality. So why income inequality could be unfair? Here, the philosophers, the philosophical background that gives the explanation is utilitarianism. that is a philosophical approach saying that the income gives utility. In economics is a quite standard starting point for microeconomic courses. So if we imagine that the advantages, the well-being of people depend on income, it's clear that increasing your income, you increase also your utility, your well-being. But Bentham, one of the fathers of utilitarianism, said that inequality is a source of evil. If you give €1 from a rich person to a poor person, of course, the loss in terms of well-being of the rich is much lower than the increase of happiness or utility of the poor. And then this is interesting because, as you know, Robin Hood was active in this area. But it's also important from a mathematical point of view because the inequality indices, for instance, the well-known Gini index, and so any measure of inequality has to respect this principle that is called the Robin Hood principle. There are also other names, but here I prefer this one, that says that if I have an income distribution and I transfer income from a rich to a poor person, the assessment of inequality has to decrease.
So now we know a lot more, and I hope with that knowledge we're just going to go and change the world. We're talking kind of around elections as well, so this is also good to kind of, for people to think where we want to go and what is the future. But what remains is to thank you very much, Eugenio, for coming today and sharing all these interesting insights with us.
It was a pleasure, and I hope that we will meet again for discussing the new findings of the next years.
I hope so too, and it's the way you sounded means that I think you're still happy, just like you were in the beginning. So I've done a good job. Thank you very much. And this is it for today. Thank you very much for listening. As usual, don't forget to subscribe, to follow us, to check us out on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or wherever you get your podcasts. We are all there and we will happily hear from you. This was Silax, and my name is Hanna Siemaszko.